I think we have a geographic diversity on this panel here, and I'd like to just start off by asking, so we've got coverage of Europe, we've got coverage of Asia Pacific. I also heard a little bit of Latin America in there, Barris, by coming into Mexico. Maybe if we can talk a little bit about your views about your domestic markets and the U.S. How do you look at accessing innovation and the development of innovation? So why don't we start with Kadir, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your view on that?
Yeah, so I think it is slightly different for pharma versus devices. I do mostly medical device investments. But the market, whether it's devices or pharma, tends to be more driven by the US view. And that's just, at least on the device side, more so, I would say. So as we look at innovation, we are looking at, first of all, getting into the European market, the CE mark, which tends to be easier than getting a FDA approval in the US. So we do look at that. What it helps us is the CE mark and European experience, and a lot more actually in the device side. There's a lot more Latin American development side. When you look at a device in the early stage of development, it tends to, a lot of work gets done in Brazil for some reason. I don't know why, but there's the docs where sometimes US trained go to Brazil and do the development. So we do kind of look at that as a kind of proving grounds for innovation in those markets. And then it gets right commercial adoption in Europe. So we tend to kind of look at how the devices are getting adopted and how reimbursement kind of fares. Because the risk, at least in the device side, tends to come slightly later compared to pharma, where the risk is a lot front-loaded. So so European markets tends to kind of help it kind of see how the adoption of the device goes and on the reimbursement fares and how it's going to work in the US. So from an innovation point of view, we are looking at, so what is it going to take for such an idea and opportunity to get to approval in the US? And what is the funding requirement to get to that time point? And working to form a syndicate, hopefully with local investors, and because especially as we go into geographies which we are not familiar with, we would love to work with local investors. I mean, especially for example, in the thing that we did in Denmark for the first time, we worked with a local investor because we are not sure about the local customs and culture. But we want to develop a syndicate that gets it to a point, and as I mentioned earlier, we are a strategic investor. We want to get sure there is what is the time frame in terms of where we would onboard the technology, and making sure there is funding requirement for that.
Winston, what do you think? Can you give us a little view from your perspective about how you're accessing and how you're developing and how you're domestic versus the US market? How does that play in?
Right. I think the regulatory environment in the Asia-Pacific countries has changed from what it was in the past, emulating what's been being done in the US FDA and doing a registration process in Asia-Pacific. Things have changed. Products, and I've personally done 2 products that was approved in Asia-Pacific countries like Japan, China, and Taiwan before United States approval. And the approval lag can be 18 to 24 months when the distributor or the companies in Asia-Pacific is actually marketing the product before the product was being blasted in the United States. So from my perspective, that's why I'm building that ecosystem. I'm hoping that Diamond Biopharm will be able to participate jointly with investors in the United States, that we focus on what we are doing best is to bring portfolio companies with market accessibility, understanding the regulatory environment, and perhaps looking at multiple jurisdiction approval at the same time while we are waiting for the US FDA scrutiny process.
So a lot of holding off for the FDA. Anybody else want to chime in before we go into another area? Anything else you want to add?
Maybe I want to briefly comment on Japan. I'm not Japanese. I originate from China. I lived and started and worked in Japan for 10 years. I think I know Japanese market very well. And so basically, if you want to make a biotech a success story, you need 3 factors. You need really the innovative science, you need the money, the capital, and you need the operation team. I think the problem in Japan is the operation team, because in Japan, most people working for big pharma is like a lifetime employment. People do not want to quit their job to jump into a biotech company. So that is the problem for why there is no so many successful stories from the biotech companies in Japan, and I hope the things will change in the future.
Lisa, if I may add, I think one of the things that we are also seeing is investors in China, and this has happened to at least 2 portfolio companies in our portfolio right now, where we would be kind of working on a path to US approval or commercializing in Europe, but Chinese investors coming in to get specific China rights so that they can pursue the FDA approval. And the investment that they make is pretty meaningful. And they are not as valuation sensitive because in return for the investment, they're also getting rights for China. So it has also added to our cash flow situation a lot, at least in the 2 companies that we are talking about, which helps because right now we are not going to pursue the China market initially. So investors come in, we get the money, and they get the rights, and it seems to be a win-win situation.
So let's go into that theme. We'll take a question at the end about investment syndication. So you guys you have your investment and you need to syndicate that. Let's talk a little bit about how you syndicate, who are your syndication partners, and some of the benefits or the issues that you face when you syndicate across borders like this. Luis, maybe you want to start us off there?
Yeah, sure. So I'll separate again device and therapeutics. On the therapeutic side, when we look at it, we look at it as a global game off the gates. And the reason is if you look at the top 10 pharma, the top 20 pharma, if you really look at it, there's maybe 4 or 5 that are US based. The rest of them are actually in Europe, they're in Japan. So it's really a global game, and it's fair game that you can go to Merck Germany or Merck here, you can go to Novartis in Switzerland, you can go to J&J here and so forth. So what we try to look at is the syndication in the beginning has to give the company the right runway to get to a proof of concept. So it's very dangerous to start a company and get it off the ground. We call this Evel Knievel investment. So it looks good on takeoff, but it's bound for a crash because it's going to be sustained. The ramp's going to be there to sustain. So we actually look at a model very similar to what I call the predominant model that's used now, which is right in the beginning, you have to have the right proof of concept that before it gets to institutional capital. So that means you have to have non-dilutive financing. And what's great about Europe, if you structure it right, you can tap into Horizon 2020, and then if you have the right PI collaboration, we look at this very closely, we strike a PI collaboration cross-border, and that doesn't have to be Boston, it can be New York, it can be San Francisco, it can be wherever it is. The key is that entity has to be eligible for NIH funding or any type of funding from DoD. Then what you do is you have double leverage. You have leverage on two pieces of equity, 2 pieces of grants. And then we think that strategics is extremely important. I think the latest stat shows, and I don't have it in front of me, but I believe, maybe a decade ago, strategics in early stage financing was not that high. It might have been 7% of all deals. Now it hovers in a 35 to 40% range. And I even think the top life sciences investors say that about 47% of the time they're looking for a strategic coming in. And the reason for that, you have to eliminate clinical risk, you have to eliminate regulatory risk know-how, meaning that when you launch globally, you have to know the US, you have to know Europe, and you have to know Asia. And those markets are key to know, and all those have different regulatory hurdles and challenges. And the clinical path is very daunting, and very few VCs will take clinical risk. So right from the gates, you have to look at this as a very long journey of 7 to 10 years. And in that beginning, that syndication has to have enough to eliminate capital risk. You have to have enough development risk in there so that you hit the right proof of concepts. And usually with those deals, you'll have exit points. So if you do hit right milestones, it triggers capital, it triggers some type of collaboration, it might even trigger an exit. And then finally, I can't underestimate or understate the importance of these early stage PI collaborations because those really open up the world to a lot of non-dilutive financing and a tremendous amount of capital from foundations and other sources that can really make the difference. And most companies, we encourage them, one of the things that everyone wants to go meet with a venture capitalist first, but we do know we look at that as jet fuel. So jet fuel is really designed when the company is ready to take off. We try to be conservative until we really need it. So.
Chris, maybe you want to talk a little bit about this?
So I guess to comment on strategy and value add of syndicate investors in our case, perhaps I want to take a quick step back and address the market access because I think it's related. So Korea, which is our primary focus, it's a very dynamic place, large economy and all that, but the fact is the domestic market, South Korea domestic drug market is pretty small. I think it's about 15, 16, 17 billion US dollars. So it's very small. So investors can still make money. So that has very little to do with the market size. However, for the companies that we invested in, domestic Korean companies, their value is to the eyes of investors and the public market, their ability to go out of Korea, get out of Korea, and do business outside of Korea. So when we invest in companies, for example, we have a portfolio company where we syndicated with this a very large US-based VC, which has a very large presence in China, because we were thinking that this company would, one of its important strategy, clinical strategy, partnering strategy would be to partner with a Chinese company, Chinese pharma company, which as a whole, Chinese pharma company have been frequenting to Korea recently over the last few years for licensing deals. So something like that can value add to our portfolio companies. So when we were talking about potential syndication, we were very happy that we were able to syndicate with this large Chinese VC, which is headquartered in the US, US VC, which is very, very active in China. So that's the kind of syndication strategy that we pay a lot of attention to execute on. And we also have a syndicate in the form of Global Pharma VC, which co-invested in one of our companies. And they obviously do add important values. So that's very important. And I think the value of syndication is largely, obviously, both either financial and or strategic. And a lot of times, I think good co-investors come in the form of both.
So I've heard a lot about corporate strategics and when they get involved, and we've talked a little bit about accessing innovation, financing innovation, and I hear that right now that it's not a lack of capital, it's the lack of expertise to build on an asset is the key point right now in the marketplace. So we all can get capital, we all can, there's access to this innovation, but the ability to talk about and have a team that helps us do that. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges that you face on the development side and having the right team to support the development of the technology that you're going through, what you have in your market. Winston, maybe you want to start us out on that?
In our experience at Diamond Biofund, unfortunately, the frustration really, technology coming out from Asia Pacific, a lack of the people's piece. There's usually a wonderful program, the technology piece is there. Patent, those laundry checklists is out there, those boxes we could always check it. But I think we still need a lot of commercialization expertise and real operator who understand maintaining, building a sustainable business, especially at the earliest stage of development in a company in this infancy. And a lot of times we'll see scientists coming out from the university or academia setting, and they are very interested in their science. Tomorrow will be better than today, rather than focusing on the regulatory pathway, because that is viewed as very boring, it's not fancy, and pardon my use of not sexy enough. So having them staying focused and managing a team of people, all of a sudden it's collaboration between multidiscipline becomes quite challenging. As opposed to the United States, because this has a long history in the success of biotechnology. There's a very good public-private environment that has fueled the growth of biotech companies. So the expertise is really here. And for a company based out in Taiwan, we look at, that's even harder than pulling teeth out, is to recruit people back to work in Taiwan. It's not within the radar screen for a lot of people. And I do recruitment every year. Everybody knows Winston Town is trying to recruit people to go to Taiwan. And the first thing they tell, and the first thing they will tell me is, I love Thai food. So that's really the challenges. It's really the people's piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of it's cultural. So just really the paradigm. So there's probably three elements to it. So one of them is education. And I mentioned Mexico earlier. This is one of the things we've set up in Mexico, very equivalent, which is what we call a venture academy. So we actually will teach the principles of how to run a business once you get funded in Portugal. So in other words, there are certain things you have to do. You have to understand how to interface with an investor. You have to understand how to build a management team. You have to understand how to go after your sales and marketing targets. So those are taught in formal sessions over a year period. It's a formal venture academy. They go. There's no degree. There's no certificate. However, they're expected to go as part of the conditions of the term sheet to complete that curriculum. The second part is we do ask for most of the companies to hire what they call a non-executive director. It doesn't have to be a formal board member, but most of the companies are required to find an industry expert. So for example, we have some companies in the therapeutics areas, they have reached out to very successful entrepreneurs, whether it's in the device area or therapeutics, who have had good success. And they will actually engage these people under very attractive terms to be non-executive directors, both in terms of equity and compensation, in terms of consultants. Some directors, of course, just want equity in the company. And then the third element is we found it to be a benefit because there isn't a whole entire pool of people who can sit on board and guide companies. If you can, to get the lead term sheet to come from a non-Portugal investor, and that will, what you will inherit is more expertise on the board side. You'll inherit a separate network. So it is very challenging because if those three things aren't done right, we don't educate the CEO, we don't get a lead executive director, we don't get another perspective, what could happen is the company could be very misguided in terms of their initial steps. And no matter how much money they can raise, then they'll be in for a challenge for the next round. The team won't work. So I have to really say that we've had experiences in both. We have some that we thought we started the right way and they didn't. And then some we were almost fortunate that they had a lead investor, there was a non-executive director, it just kind of all fell together. So now we have a formula, we said this is the right way to go.
That's good. Chris, maybe you can also elaborate.
Sure. So we talked a lot about value add to the portfolio companies as an investor. So when our fund was first put together, one of the premise was to obviously how to work this out so that investors benefit and companies benefit. And one way that we are doing it is we bring in expertise from US. So for example, we have an EIR, we have a number of EIRs who have looked at the project and who is actually working on a project, which if all goes well, we could be the investor in the company. So we operate in a way that had not operated in the traditional types of Korean venture type, where EIRs are put onto a seed project where investment commitment from us have not yet been made, and the executive would work on it and bring it to a certain level where we would then come in. So that's a kind of one aspect of value add that we bring from the U.S. And also, so by definition, South Korea and all these countries, these are emerging countries in terms of biotech industry. And by definition, obviously, again, to the point that was mentioned, biotech executives, there are not enough of them, I think, relative to the potential of innovation that is coming out of those countries. So that has always been I guess a challenge that we see. And there are some serial entrepreneurs in places like Korea where he or she is able to sort of do it again and again. But again, if you look at the entire greater ecosystem, that's just not enough. And there's always catch-22, right? So people like us go in there and help sort of cultivate the environment and the ecosystem and culture, and then hopefully more of those people would come around later.
Great. So sort of keeping with the theme about looking at where you're getting your investments, talking about intellectual property. Intellectual property on a global basis is becoming a hot topic. It's very expensive for startup companies. It's probably part of their first key expense as they go and enter a marketplace. So let's talk a little bit about how you view intellectual property, where you're getting it from. Is it from your domestic markets? Is it from the US market? And how do you guide the development and the nurturing of that intellectual property to your companies? So maybe Gary, maybe let's start.
Yeah, so IP is obviously fundamental in any of the businesses that we invest. The few exceptions are possibly some businesses and consumer that we invest in, where it's more of a business model rather than the technology itself. In terms of the IP, we focus on all of the key markets that we talked about earlier. I mean, the US, EU, South America, China, India, Japan, obviously, and South Korea. Those are all the kind of the themes that kind of come up. One of the things that we do, and I believe other VCs do that as well, is during the diligence process, obviously we do an in-depth review of the IP situation. We have whether it's prior art and looking at the prosecution history, everything. And once we decide to make the investment from day 2 of that, we work very closely with the company to see where the gaps are, to make sure that they identify what the gaps are and then make steps to go after it. And then I think on the device side, what we see is not aggressive enough to be able to extend the technology further, to make the claims much broader than what the inventor could have been thinking about. So, and that's an ongoing process to make sure that we continue to keep tabs on that and do a check at every, for example, follow-on investment to make sure that the path is going forward, and that becomes a win-win situation for us. So that ultimately, if you do decide to acquire the asset, there is no surprises at the IP level.
Chris, maybe you talk a little bit about
Sure.
where you're finding your IP and how much you guys invest in.
So, so after U.S., Japan, now China and Germany, South Korea makes most number of international patent filing annually. So there's a lot coming out, and if you look at the top 10 universities in the world which files IP, the highest number of IPs, 9 are US-based universities, usual suspects, and one is a Korea-based university, KAIST, Korea Advanced Institute of Technology. It's kind of like MIT equivalent in Korea. So there's a lot of patents that are being filed, and that also means that people care about it for obvious reason. And for biotech, so the value of intangible assets didn't really, were not really recognized, say, decade ago, 15 years ago, and for that reason, again, back then, which wasn't too long ago, if you think about it, the company which did not have revenues, which did not have net income, but which only had like IP, were really not attractive investments, especially in the public market. So those companies were not able to go public in Korea, but things have changed. So again, I guess my point is IP is seen as very important in Korea. And for the companies that we invested in, it's really case by case, because if we invest in an antibody company, IP and antibody is very, very complicated, right? And you can never really do, especially for startup companies, you can really never do like full-blown, freedom to operate study, because it just costs so much, and you have to draw a line as to where to stop eventually. So we do deep IP due diligence, but we understand that there is always a limit to it. And if the company gets really successful, little company gets really successful, then you're gonna get sued on your IP in some way, which is it's good and bad. So it's a sort of validation of what you're doing in certain way. Yeah, factor of success. So it's good and bad.
Yeah.
So.
Anyone else have anything else to add on the panel from IP side or?
Something small. I think even the initial steps in IP is critical. Many times the companies say they have the intellectual property, but we want to make sure. So tech transfer, the way it's done in North America, is maybe somewhat unique. In some countries, the universities will part with the intellectual property, belongs to the faculty or belongs to the PI. In other countries, there's just no process to do that. And some countries, when they see the IP, then they wrangle with you for a while before they give it up because they think it's valuable. So actually that initial step is very critical, and we also think it's important to have the right counsel early. And sometimes that's the biggest expense early on, is that we will put a very expensive counsel early. And part of that is a patent reform that's going on in Europe right now, where you might get one patent and it covers all 32 jurisdictions, but then there's little things you have to do in each jurisdiction to make it so. And then, mentioned earlier the freedom to operate analysis, and it has to be defensible. Ultimately, early on, other than the management team, the IP, the mechanism of action, or some prototype that's defensible is probably the single largest value of the company. And so that has to be really done right. There's nothing that would turn off an investor more to look at it, and it's a mess, so it's not done right, it's not clear. So we pay a lot of attention to that, and probably are very careful making sure that that's done accurately so that the rest of the world can respect it and understand what's done.
Perhaps I'll add my 2 cents in terms of from the operational aspect of things. My personal experience and my advice to my portfolio companies is really finding patent lawyers who are also litigators. When you have litigated a patent, you know how to write a good patent. And previously, my experience was maybe I will go to Australia as a first country of filing and use that patent office as a PCT. But my work relationship with Australian lawyers are not that they are bad, but they just think very differently as US lawyers. If this is the big market we're trying to protect, I think it's not an option whether we should come to US as a first country of filing, it must be. And on average, I think the US Patent Office offers action, it's about 18 to 20 months, which is much shorter. They will take the first office action as opposed to a lot of Asian countries or European countries. And my limited experience tell me that, for example, countries in Japan or Korea, finding a local partner, the local patent office who speed up or expedite it, intentionally or unintentionally in prosecuting, taking office action in that regard. And my limited experience with China is even more interesting. I also manages a monoclonal antibody. And our submission, our patent was filed with the China Patent Office long ago. And I realized there was a delay because in China, the entire patent office has only 18 reviewers doing the biological review. They are not as sophisticated. The science is very complicated, as my peer Chris has mentioned, alluded to the fact it's very complicated science. So there's a learning curve, an education process, dealing with the China Patent Office as well. And my patent was actually delayed at the time in prosecution because the reviewer was pregnant. She was very sick. She has no mood to work. So I cannot contact her, unlike the US Patent Office. You can call the reviewer and discuss with them. She's not going to entertain us. I have my patent lawyer in Beijing going to see her personally. She won't see him. And after she come back from maternity leave, she has suffered depression. So she's not going back to the office. So that was actually a factor that we must consider when we go to quote-unquote developing countries and prosecuting our patent as they are becoming more and more important in managing a dynamic patent portfolio management process. So
Very
that's
good.
my 2 cents.
No, very good advice I think we're hearing is that, every market is very specific. You have to have expertise in that local market, and that's very good advice, but global IP is really critical. And I would second that, invest in that very strongly. That's your asset. Well, I think you guys have been very, very helpful. I'd like to just go down the list and ask you for a very brief statement, each one of you, key issue, and key point you'd like to share with the group. Very quickly, we'll go down from there, and then I want to leave time for a couple questions from the audience.
So key issue, key point. So I think the thing we like to tell our portfolio companies is really orient them towards the notion of de-risking. You've heard that word. So we give them a de-risking scorecard. We said these are the 9 areas your company is going to migrate in. And we stay very fixated on that. They'll get an investment thesis, and every activity that they do is matched into the de-risking process. I think the key point on that, a lot of it has to do with capital efficiency and milestones. So we try to do that to match it with capital efficiency and milestones. Sometimes you have to make a tough decision, and other times you want to make a go decision, but it has to be based on the fact that we've done all that we can to prep the company for the next stage. So that's my 2 key points, or 1 key point.
Well done.
So I think the world is getting flatter and flatter. Product development is really for the global market. As Asia-Pacific market is getting more and more attention because of the sheer market size. And there are a lot of companies here really looking into investors coming from Asia-Pacific. And I would encourage, because there's a cultural difference, we are brought up very differently in the educational system, so a yes may not be a yes, and a no might not necessarily be a no.
Maybe one advice when you do deal with Japanese company, and it takes time to close the deal with the Japanese company. But once you close the deal, the relationship also is much longer than the typical other relationship you have.
Maybe I'll close with more of an appeal. We said there is enough money around the table, but I think in pharma and biotech probably that is true at this point. But I think one thing I'm worried about is early stage medical device companies. I don't know if there's anyone here raising money in medical devices early stage. It is not an easy task, and it definitely takes a village. So when I see you as entrepreneurs, and I've got to be able to find the source of capital, but also maybe work with local, possibly government entities, because when I see $1 in Israel gets leveraged to $8 because of CSO's office, I said, why can't, the government, the US gonna do it? I know that in Massachusetts it's been very biotech friendly, but we don't see enough of that going on. So as acquirers, I get worried. I mean, what are we going to harvest what we sow? And if there's not enough seeds out there, we won't have opportunities in innovation coming down the pipe. So it goes on all of us to be able to change that status quo.
Great. Thank you all very much for that. So I'd like to open it up for questions, I guess.
Yeah, I have a bit of an awkward question maybe for Winston, but an entrepreneur. I have a company in Paris and one in Canada. I'd love to get into the Chinese market. I'd love to get Chinese money. I'm terrified of reverse engineering. We're not big enough to litigate if somebody runs with it. So reassure me. I think it's out there. It's the question that's there.
Well, I think, Asia Pacific, not only China, has come a long way. It's not an option whether they need to play according to international rules. They know it. But I cannot give you an answer that will give you 100% certainty. But I think going to China market, if you are looking, if Asia Pacific is very much within your radar screen, I think it's not an option whether you should go or not go. But really finding the right partners. Larger companies, I mean, they do things quite proper, especially companies, I was talking to a few companies I met, are returnees, the second generation, younger generation, who has come to the United States doing postdoc here or received a tertiary education here. They went back to China, set up their own operation. They get it. They know the rules of game. So I hope I have eliminated your fear
I think I trust the companies more than the government.
The government actually, ironically, I've just seen a paper being published, hopefully it will be blessed by the National People Congress in November, that they are opening up the China FDA has opened up the entire approval process. In the past, you need to redo all your non-clinical program, your clinical program, you need local manufacturing. That has all been eliminated. If that has been blessed in November this year at the National People's Congress meeting, next year they will be implementing it. Meaning if you have an open IND, open IDE product in the West, you could actually concurrently start a clinical program without the need of duplicating all the great work you have done in the past. So they are actually changing slowly, progressively. It's the regulatory approval process, which is quite not transparent to a lot of us who are used to an open dialogue with the regulatory agencies. But in November, I think they are tabling that as a motion to be approved at the highest level of their bureaucracy, if you allow me to use that word. I think implementation will come a little later, but typical to a lot of things in mainland China, even the implementation stage, it takes a while to kick into full force. But at least it's a good news for a lot of companies, stateside, Europe, or wherever we are, that we don't need to necessarily, in an earlier stage development, to find a local partner. As long as you have an open IND in EMA, in the United States, you could actually start your clinical development program in China.
Yeah.
So, except for Chris, I haven't heard anyone say that they will invest in U.S. companies, and the model being put the headquarters someplace in the U.S. and then have a development group perhaps working in your home country, and then you do some funding. So is that a model that the rest of you, or maybe Chris can speak to as well, that you contemplate or currently using, or are you really all focused in home countries?
I mean, we invest all over the place. I mean, we U.S. Outside. I think what we have seen more is companies, as they get to certain stages, they might have some development capabilities, or if they need some commercial outlet, then I've seen companies, so development, and this happens to all of the companies in Israel. So they have the development arm in Israel, but as they branch out a little bit more to commercialization, they have the headquarters or enough presence in the U.S. For the commercial operations. And now all the development continues to happen in Israel, and that seems to work quite well. And there are some other reasons. If they're especially funded by the Office of the Chief Scientist in Israel, there are certain things you cannot take out of the country without certain legal aspects of it. So that seems to work fine.
So you make a good point. I'll give you guys a good case study. So I think initially the model was that Series A would come for companies based there, then Series B would come from the rest of the world. Almost by accident, it happened the other way. What happened is we gave the entrepreneurs a lot of freedom to look at their first round of financing, and there was a high level of interest in the healthcare IT space. And some of these companies ended up, Portugal for a small country, between Techstars, Y Combinator, Seed Camp, and even Mass Challenge here. So if you look at the top accelerators in the world, we ended up with 7th place in very highly selective programs. And what that did, it generated a lot of term sheets, 4 in London and 2 in California, 1 in Boston, that came from the likes of Google Ventures. They also came from the likes of Yuri Milner, who's a Russian oligarch behind 23andMe. And that created actually Portugal's first unicorn, so to speak. And it became access. So now we actually will leave it up to the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur can get a Series A, and they can make a strategic commitment to the country. We're agnostic about the fact that that's to be headquartered there. And I think that's probably the right way to do it. But initially, it was designed that way because as part of the austerity measure, I had to ignite the ecosystem. But now that the ecosystem is ignited, I think it's up to the entrepreneur. So if they can put together a syndicate, I'm more than glad to match it or to be a second or to be someone in the capital structure. But if they come to us first, then it has to be based on that.
I think that's all we have time for, but thank you very much, everybody on our panel. That was very helpful.